Hello everyone, so we're back today continuing our talk about the fighting of the Cold War, and today I'm just going to give a few different examples, okay? One in which will involve like USA and Russia, some proxy war stuff, the Korean War. We're getting into a variety of different things. Understand that these are not the only conflicts that have occurred. This is just a selected few, mostly that have to do with the AP World History curriculum, so feel free to look up some other stuff because there's definitely much more. And I also will cover some of these conflicts in my video on decolonization, so you could check that out as well. All right. So probably one of the largest of all of these conflicts was the Korean conflict or the Korean War. And this is going to be one that is a bit of a hot war, if you will, between USA and China. And we have to include China in this as well. So after World War II, both there was communist Chinese presence and U.S. presence in Korea. And the whole idea was trying to figure out exactly what was going to happen with Korea after World War II. And so basically, the country was divided along the 38th parallel into a North and South Korea. North Korea, which would be supporting communism. South Korea, which would not be communist, democratic, and pro-U.S. And the plan was that in a few years that they would have elections that would unify the nation and we would have one Korea based on what the majority of the people would want. Well, that didn't last very long. Being supported by China, the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who you see a picture there on the right, decides to make a move, and in June of 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. And early on, they have tremendous levels of success. If you look on the map there, you can see they push deep down into South Korea and actually push South Korean and U.S. forces down to the bottom corner of Korea around the city of Busan, where they're able to hold. So North Korea almost conquers all of South Korea. However, U.S. and Korean forces hold, as you see there on the right, around the Busan perimeter. Now the question becomes, well, what's going to happen next? And in this case, President Truman and the United States are going to do an interesting move. World War II had just finished 5 years earlier. I don't think you had a lot of support in Congress for the declaration of war in this case. So what Truman is going to do is he is going to go to the United Nations and ask them to act on the Korean War, because this is one of the reasons why the UN was created. Now, here's the catch. So according to their bylaws, it is the Security Council that determines whether or not the UN will use force. And there are certain nations on there that have veto power that can nix it. One big benefit here is communist China, which is the bulk of all of China at this point, was not actually recognized in the United Nations at that point. So they're not represented, and their interests in supporting North Korea, thus, not represented there. The Soviet Union, because China wasn't in the UN, had been boycotting United Nations proceedings. So the U.S. gets the UN to vote to send force. We, not surprisingly, volunteer, and the UN forces will be sent over there under General Douglas MacArthur, and 90% of the troops will be from the United States of America. And that's why typically this is referred to as the Korean conflict, because technically the U.S. did not declare war, but believe me, when you look at the fighting, it was war. Early on, the United States is going to have some incredible successes. One of the big things we do is we pull off this crazy landing at Incheon. And if you look on the map, Incheon is right up here, okay, which was crazy because it was actually well behind enemy lines. And this was a big deal. And so the U.S. is going to come in. We're going to be able to hit the Koreans from multiple sides and then eventually push them completely out of North Korea. Now, technically, that's what was supposed to happen. U.S. comes in, gets North Korea out of South Korea, game. But didn't work out like that. MacArthur, because he's got them on the run, will then advance into North Korea and look to take that part over. But then it gets really dicey. As you can see on this map, the United States forces, or the UN forces, are driving really far up. China then says, look, you need to stop. We see this as a threat. We think you're going to attack China. If you continue on in North Korea, we are going to respond. Well, we don't. And China hits us. Okay, here you actually have a propaganda poster to get people involved in China against, that's a, caricature of MacArthur there. And China pushes the U.S. back, and then basically we get stuck in the middle right around the original line, and no one can seem to take an advantage. But the war just starts grinding on. Then you have a fascinating move in which you get this big-time tension between General MacArthur and Truman. Truman's actually going to fly out and meet with MacArthur. And MacArthur basically says that he wants to take the war to China. And he's also not against using nukes in China either. Truman basically says, look, we can't do that. That will massively escalate this war. It could turn into a larger regional struggle, and you can bring in the Soviets. So you can't do that. MacArthur then responds by trashing Truman in the press, basically calling him all but a coward, and that the U.S. can't win this war because of Truman. Truman, naturally, because you're wondering if this guy is going to disobey orders and invade China, fires MacArthur. Which, in military, or in political terms, he had to do that. You can't let that go. Politically, it also hurts Truman, though, because MacArthur was basically beloved. He actually returns, you see the newspaper up there. He gets a massive parade in New York City, but Truman is able to hold things off. But the fallout of this will kind of result in Truman stepping away and actually choosing not to run for office and re-election in 1952, when technically he could have. Eventually, you do get some peace talks, and they are stalling, okay? It's not working out, and we're wondering, could war kind of re-break out? That is when Eisenhower's going to enter the fray. In 1952, Eisenhower's running for the presidency. He starts alluding to maybe he might be a little bit more aggressive, maybe bringing full U.S. forces into this, and we need to end it. He is elected, and then not too long afterwards, in 1953, we have the peace agreement, if you will, that lasts to today. Technically, a peace treaty has not ever been done, and there is technically a state of war between the two sides, although in the last year, we've had meetings between the leaders of North and South Korea, and that's been a really big deal. It's been really important. But as far as Cold War is concerned, so what they decide to do is North Korea basically stays North Korea, South Korea stays South Korea, and what they're going to do is create a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, okay, between the North and South Korean borders so that they don't actually share a border. The only place where they do, if you look on the bottom right there, is Panmunjom, where you do have meeting buildings that either side can meet in, although it doesn't happen very often. You see there South Korean soldiers who are always on guard because this is the most tense area of the DMZ, and it was pretty tense. And this was a brutal war. I mean, 35,000 people are killed. The tension is still there. You have nuclear issues in North Korea as well. But this is kind of how the war plays out. So in this particular case, this is the hottest war. The reason why I talk about this is because you actually had direct fighting between two of the powers, communist Russia communist China and the United States of America. A lot of times it's going to take a little bit of a different feel. And one of those different places will be in Cuba. So Cuba is created in 1959 with the overthrow of the previous government by Fidel Castro. They immediately will embrace communism. The Soviet Union will be a big ally, and the U.S. freaks out because they're only 90 miles from the United States of America, and they don't like that. And so what we have now is what is known as the Bay of Pigs disaster, because it's exactly that, and everything surrounding Cuba. So the United States wants to get rid of Castro, and the CIA under Eisenhower start to develop a plan to do that. And that involves a group called La Brigada. So La Brigada was, as you see on the bottom left there, a picture of them, were Cuban exiles that we were going to train to lead an insurrection in Cuba, that we would get them to Cuba, and we were going to land in the Bay of Pigs, as it was called, Bahia de Cochinos. We're going to land them there to start a revolution because we really felt, and our intelligence told us incorrectly, that most people already by 1961 were not liking Castro, and that if we run this and they hear there's a revolt, the people will rise up, we'll get rid of Castro, and it's going to be awesome. JFK has some hesitancy to this, but he allows kind of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA to convince them, and we launch the plan. It's a catastrophe. On April 17th, 1961, we start the plan, and it takes us over 2 hours to get the troops onto the shore. Because it takes over 2 hours, they are spotted, and the Cuban military is ready for La Brigada, and they get pinned down on the beach. At that point, JFK panics and is like, well, we have to try to figure out a way for us to not get caught in it, to almost make it look like just a Cuban exile thing. So what we were supposed to do is give La Brigada air support to support their efforts in, taking over the country, and we do nothing. We abandon them. The air support does not come. Every single member is captured or killed. Probably over time, they were all killed, and we look terrible. The Russians kill us at a summit. Our international allies are like, what are you doing? And issues over Cuba are just getting worse. And that's when we come to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the most tense of moments, and this is really what the Cold War was all about. On October 14th, 1962, a United States spy mission, U-2 Spy Plane, which flies really high up, was taking pictures of Cuba, and we discovered that the Soviets had put nuclear weapons in Cuba. That's what the picture up top is. I don't know what any of it means. I just know that that was the stuff that were like, missiles. So that's no good, especially because, as future intelligence would tell us, they basically had missiles in there that had enough range to hit everywhere in the United States with the exception of Seattle. That's no good. JFK is then immediately faced with a question. He's like, do I make an announcement? Do I keep it to ourselves? Do I put weapons real close to Russia? We have allies in Turkey, which we already have weapons in. Do we put nukes in, say, Finland or Greece? Maybe. The Joint Chiefs of Staff want him to attack Cuba. They want it to hit. We don't think the missiles are operational. We want you to go in, and basically they want us a full-blown invasion of Cuba. Get rid of the missiles, follow it up with a land invasion, get Castro out. So this goes behind closed doors off and on, and Kennedy, very wisely, does not want to use force. He sees it, one, as a bad image for the United States, especially if big United States goes and crushes tiny Cuba. That's going to actually, they think, or they, Kennedy and his closest advisors, that's just going to drum up support really for communism. And then two, he's not sure, can we get all the missiles? Might they launch a missile? This is no good. And so on October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy goes on air and just says everything that we found. And we decide that we are going to put a quarantine on Cuba, which means we're going to basically put up a naval blockade to prevent any new things from going into Cuba, and that the Soviets need to pull this out. Nikita Khrushchev, who is the leader of the Soviets, immediately denies all of this and says most of the aid is humanitarian in nature and not military. As a result of this craziness, there's an emergency meeting of the United Nations. However, during those meetings, the Soviets initially are denying what was happening, not realizing the level of pictures and intelligence that the U.S. had. And the U.S. ambassador, his name was Adlai Stevenson, who actually had run for president a couple times against Eisenhower, exposes all of the information that we have, now making Russia look bad, but we still have this tension. It really reaches a fever point where we decide to try to send another U-2 mission there to spy out, to find as much information about those missiles as we can, because if we have to go in, we can't miss anything. Rudolf Anderson Jr. volunteers for the mission, and tragically, he is shot down and killed. At that point, there's tremendous pressure on JFK. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are clamoring for invasion, but he makes the decision not to. And a lot of people point the tragic death of Rudolf Anderson was actually like a moment of clarity by both the United States on JFK and as well on the Russian case by Khrushchev. Because all of a sudden they realized, like, yo, we have a casualty. We have actually started shooting. Are we going to actually do this? Are we going to launch these missiles? The U.S. gets a series of letters from the Soviets. Some are dubious. Some are interesting. But what it results in is basically a secret meeting between Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, and JFK's closest confidant as his brother, and the ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. And what they do is they come up with a deal. The Russians will pull all of their weapons out of Cuba. We will promise not to invade Cuba. And then we promise to pull our missiles out of Turkey down the road, which we do. Man, was it close. It was really close. And luckily enough, it didn't happen. Another type of war that we see here really is a truest sense of a proxy war. The idea of a proxy war is a war in which we don't actually fight, but we fight through surrogates. And in the Cold War, that happened all the time. The Soviets would pick a side, we would pick a side, and unfortunately, the people of that country, in some cases, would pay the price. Such would be the case in the country of Nicaragua. In 1979, Nicaragua was overthrown by a group called the Sandinistas. They overthrow the Somoza family, which you see there, a gentleman on the right, who had basically been dictators of the country for like 40 years. As soon as they overthrow, as you see a picture of them there in 1979, they declare themselves to be a socialist nation, and they will immediately develop a strong relationship with the Russians. Lots of military equipment, credit, economic subsidies, all of that. The U.S., of course, does not like that, and so they are going to look to find a group that can potentially overthrow the Sandinistas, because we do not want any communist governments in, or communist nations in the Western Hemisphere. The group that we find are the Contras. The problem with the Contras is that they were extraordinarily violent in what they were doing with our support. They not only would fight the Sandinistas, but as you see there in a picture on the top left, they used child soldiers. They would terrorize locals. They would destroy villages. They wouldn't just fight a straight-up war with the Sandinistas. The fact of the matter is the United States wasn't concerned with that. What they were concerned with was getting an overthrow of the Sandinistas. And it was brutal. When Congress actually found out about that, they passed a law prohibiting U.S. involvement in the war any longer. That's also going to result in something called the Iran-Contra scandal, which on the short, it was arranged that the U.S. would sell weapons actually illegally to Iran, who was fighting the Iran-Iraq war, who we were also supporting Iraq, we would funnel those weapons through them illegally through Israel. We would then take that cash and other weapons and funnel it down to the Contras in Nicaragua. Suffice to say, this was exposed. You can look up videos on that. There's tons of them. The guy that took the fall for it all on the bottom there was Oliver North, who would go to jail for that. Although there's lots of evidence that Reagan very much knew what was going on, President Reagan at the time, and gave the order. But nonetheless, the war went on. Thousands of people, actually tens of thousands, are killed until finally, especially with the fall of the Soviet Union, support for both sides is pulled, and outside nations of Central America come in to broker a peace. And in 1989, a deal is made. The two sides come together, and they actually decide to hold elections. On the bottom is Daniel Ortega, who had been the leader of the Sandinistas really since 1983 and was actually the president of Nicaragua. He would run against Violeta Chamorro, and Violeta Chamorro would actually win, and thus the war was now a complete end. And she's actually the first female head of state anywhere in the Americas. But this is just a great example of how an internal conflict can get really expanded by nations by the US and the USSR, vying for control of different areas of the world. And this was not the only place. It happens in a lot of other places. And then you have things like the Vietnam War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It's a 40-year slugfest. And in many cases, it's citizens of not those countries, the US and the USSR, that actually had to pay the price for that goal of global dominance. All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea of the variety of different types of conflicts that we could see during the Cold War. And hope you liked it. I'll see you guys soon.